Hi, Bill Heath here, Executive Director of the Land Trust. It's my great pleasure to introduce Aaron Rusak as tonight's speaker. Aaron is GBLT's new Protected Areas Manager. He came to us, we actually stole him from Muskoka Conservancy, and we're so lucky to have Aaron on board with us. Aaron does BSc from UBC in Biology and Geographical Biosciences. He is a very accomplished young individual. He's a task force member of Muskoka Integrated Watershed Management and Terrestrial Ecosystems. He's president of the Muskoka Field Naturalists. He's a regional coordinator for the Breeding Bird Atlas of Ontario for Muskoka region. He's a regional coordinator of the Muskoka region Great Lakes Monitoring Program. Aaron's going to take us through a little bit of a journey on the birds of Eastern Georgian Bay. You should know that I believe Aaron has won the Muskoka bird contest for the last 2 years. So if you have questions, this is the guy who can answer them for you. So over to you, Aaron, and we look forward to a delightful talk.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I'm going to share my screen right now and let me know if that looks weird for any reason. But yeah, I'm here today to talk about the birds of Georgian Bay. Normally, when I do some of my talks, I like to talk a bit about species identification, but I find birds somewhat challenging to do that with because we have some hundreds of birds that you would normally see in Georgian Bay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some kind of large scale identification, but I'm also going to kind of focus the talk on how to get the most out of your birding experiences in Georgian Bay, because Georgian Bay is one of my favorite, actually my favorite location in Canada to bird. But it can be kind of difficult to bird. So I'm going to try to give you some tips and tricks on how to make your time birding well spent. So Bill's already gone through a little bit of this. I am our new Protected Areas Manager. And like Bill said, I hold the Muskoka Big Year record. So I set that in 2020. I did my first Muskoka Big Year in 2019 and tied a pair of retired teachers for the record at 212 species in Muskoka. And then decided to back off birding the next year in 2020 and just kind of bird for fun and not rush around for birds, and hit 219 that year. So beating my previous record by 7 species. So despite not chasing absolutely everything I could see, I still managed to do quite well. And I find what was really interesting about the 2 big years, well, the big year, the formal big year and the informal big year that I did, is the amount of knowledge that you gain, even if you're just rushing around to chase birds, just about habits and habitats and kind of all things birds. And so big years are usually geographically based. So my Muskoka Big Year is due to Muskoka County is where I live and where I have my cottage. So it made the most sense to use that geographical area. So I currently hold it. I hit 215 species last year. I don't know what I'll get this year, but hopefully over 200. And so I wanted to talk just a bit about birds and GBLT. So what GBLT does for birds. We did see a fair bit of that in the video, but one of the key things is that GBLT protects habitat for species at risk, and specifically birds at risk. So we have about 12 species of at-risk birds that we've identified on GBLT properties and more that use them in transition. And there's several MODIS towers in operation on GBLT lands. If you really want to play with some of the remote sensing, there's a MODIS website that you can look at a bunch of different data. And that's just helping give us a sense of how birds are moving around our landscape. And there's some quite interesting things. I'm not doing a talk on MODIS because I'm not the guy that I'm helping with it. I'm not the guy that runs it. But if you dig into the data, there's some pretty interesting things to be found. So when we talk about Georgian Bay, I'm talking about kind of the GBLT operating area. So I've birded the most in this kind of southern region of Georgian Bay, but GBLT protects properties all the way up the coast, all the way to the North Channel. So although the majority of my birding has been done in the southeastern coast of Georgian Bay, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is very applicable for the larger Georgian Bay region. And there's a lot of variety of habitats that we see in Georgian Bay, but a lot of the specialties, the birds that are really unique to Georgian Bay or that we can see in large numbers, you kind of get up the coast, and in many cases you bird them in pretty much the same way. So these are just some of the properties that GBLT protects. And the cottage club where I live is down in Go Home Bay. So a lot of my birding is based out of Go Home Bay. However, I do, for the breeding bird atlas, I have regions that I cover all the way up to Sans Souci. So I'll be doing a lot, especially this year, I'll be doing a lot of Georgian Bay birding, and I'm very excited to kind of expand my range. So Georgian Bay is a land of big successes and big misses, which I'll talk about later. There's a lot of ground truthing you have to do before you find some things in Georgian Bay. So a lot of what I've found in Georgian Bay is through a fair bit of bushwhacking and some inclement weather, and just getting out as much as possible to a variety of different sites. And this photo was taken on Grey Island, or near Grey Island. So that's Grey Island is a Georgian Bay Islands National Park. It's east or west of the Pine Islands. And this is a flock of dunlin. And I really love this picture because it shows what's so diagnostic about dunlin, that black mark they have on the chest. And this was a shot taken from a boat. And one of the trials of birding on Georgian Bay is getting good photos, because a lot of times when you're doing some of the more hardcore birding, you can't land on islands because either the weather is too rough or it's just not the wind isn't blowing the right direction. So there's a lot of shooting from a boat. And this was a somewhat overcast day. It had rained earlier, and usually I just hold down the shutter button until I get something good. So managed to catch these guys in flight as they were circling some of the islands. And that day we had around 60 to 7 different dunlin. So large flocks of shorebirds are one of the coolest things you can see out in Georgian Bay, and one of my favorite things to bird out there. Hand in hand with that is another successful day we had, also out on Grey. And this is the largest number of semi-palmated sandpipers we've seen in Muskoka yet. I think it's probably the most we've seen in Parry Sound as well, but I haven't checked the numbers. We don't get a lot of large flocks of shorebirds outside of Georgian Bay. Ontario has some sewage lagoons, which you can get them in flooded fields. But when we're talking about, natural sites where we have, lots of rocks or fen mats where they normally would feed, we don't have as much of those throughout Ontario. So Georgian Bay is kind of like the last bastion of shorebird stopover sites that's remaining in a natural condition. So when we were birding this day, this also speaks to how you have to seize your opportunities in birding. So this day had rained all day. And when I'm in Georgian Bay, I check the weather religiously. And I saw that we had an hour of just cloudy weather where the rain was going to relent enough. And I said, Dad, let's go to Grey, because usually rain drops shorebirds. And if the rain dropped any shorebirds, they're going to be on Grey. So we saw the clouds kind of lightening a little bit, took our 25 out and braved the waters of Georgian Bay. Luckily, the wind was not too strong this day. There's been some days where we've had to turn around halfway into the journey because it's too strong, but it was a relatively calm day for how much rain we were getting. And the first thing we saw was a small black-bellied plover on one of the small outer islands. And black-bellied plovers are already a fairly rare bird in Georgian Bay. And so I thought, okay, well, good start. Not too bad. I mean, if that was all we got, it'd still be pretty good. Next thing on the next island was 3 ruddy turnstones. Again, quite a rare bird for Georgian Bay. So then I knew that we had to see the whole day through, whether we were going to get soaked or not. And as the rain started to pick up and we made our way up to some of the larger islands, I saw a large flock lift off, circle once, and then touch down again. And I thought, that's a large flock of shorebirds. We've got to get there. So I told my dad to get us close. I would hop off the boat and I would go and take some photos of whatever we could see. And I was greeted by a sight of these 251 semi-palmated sandpipers. There was about 5 or 6 semi-palmated plovers. There was sanderling. So all in all, we had something of about 8 shorebird species that day, and truly incredible to be able to see these large flocks wheeling. And this is a really bad photo because, as you can see on the camera lens, the rain is already picking up. But I snapped and I snapped and I snapped, and I managed to get some semi-presentable photos, or at least photos that would allow me to count. So you can actually see on this one, I'll draw, maybe circle some of the flocks of shorebirds that are kind of just resting on the edge of these pools. So shorebirds will stop. They stop over at sites like Gray or the outer islands in Georgian Bay as a way to refuel, rest before they begin migrating north again. And so this little flock had been brought down, well, large flock had been brought down in the rain, was running around feeding, but they weren't continuing on their migration. And so they eventually did, we came back the next day and there were pretty much an empty rock. So they did manage to continue on because they breed up in the Arctic. So most of them are not staying very long in Georgian Bay. And if they are, it's just to rest, refuel, and carry on. So I said that Georgian Bay was a land of big misses as well. And I have missed a lot on my trips out to various islands. We've had some really incredible days, like the days I've talked about, but then we have a day where this is the only bird I see, and I've circled it in red. And this is the best photo out of about 100 photos of this bird, because it would not stay still. It was ducking in these crevices, and we just couldn't get a camera or binoculars on it. And being one of the outer islands and unsure of who actually owned it, we decided not to land. And even if we had landed, the bird would have taken off almost immediately. So there's lots of days where absolutely nothing is seen. And that's just the reality of birding in Georgian Bay. Some days you have 200, 300 shorebirds on an island, and other days you have one that you can't identify. I have more unidentified species on my Georgian Bay checklist than anywhere else in Ontario. And I bird a lot in Ontario. So to kind of mitigate these big misses, we have learned how to bird certain areas. So this is our Gray Island route, or what our usual route is. And the tricky thing about birding in Georgian Bay is you can land on Gray Island. So that's a national park, and we often do. But if you'll notice, we walked just on the top half. So the shorebirds that we see in Gray, where I'm marking in red is where you'll see them. You'll see them on the north end of Gray. You'll see them kind of the southern edge of this island, and you'll see them on the back edge of this island. You don't see them on this island ever. You don't see them on the south half of this island ever. And I think I've seen like one on this island. So shorebirds are tricky, and birding in Georgian Bay is tricky because the rocks and the landscape create certain things that are very good for birds and certain things that are not very good for birds. So the majority of Georgian Bay is fantastic, but when you get to those outer islands where the vegetation is a lot more sparse, things like the way the current usually flows, or the way the waves are crashing up, or where the little pools are very significant for birds. So when you're moving out to those outer islands to try to see that large flock of 300 shorebirds, you're going to have to know where to look. And knowing where to look takes a lot of trips out there, because you miss a lot before you are successful. So our usual route starts where this little white marker is, and we go up here, double back, and then go up this side of these islands, and we continue on up all the way up to here, sometimes landing, and then just going around this corner. Interestingly enough, this day, so the reason we went on the west side of these islands this day is because we were feeling so good from how many birds we got this day, is we decided to do the whole thing. And what ended up is this hole, after about here, we didn't see another shorebird all the way down this side. Absolutely no shorebirds until we got back there. So figuring out where the birds are going is really key in knowing how to bird, and that is going to take a little bit of trial and error. So our Georgian Bay specialties are, I mean, in my opinion, everything is a specialty in Georgian Bay. There's a lot of amazing birds you can find. We have a large number of rare woodpeckers. We have herons, egrets that you can get, lots of different warblers, but I've kind of narrowed it down to birds that are somewhat unique to Georgian Bay in the way that we get them. So our kind of 4 specialties are shorebirds, waterfowl, gulls and terns, and prairie warblers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. Talked a little bit about shorebirds, but waterfowl, we have an interesting location with Georgian Bay in that we get a lot of the spring and fall migration of waterfowl. The only hiccup to that is a lot of time people aren't cottaging at that time, so we miss most of them. So there's old records from people that birded Beausoleil Island with like large flocks of canvasback and redhead and red-throated loons that overwintered, and a lot of really rare and unique waterfowl. So I've been going out to Beausoleil in the fall every year, and we have rare scoters there, several different types of grebes usually, lots of different ducks in the shallows. But it's not often that people are out there in April and October to be getting these rare birds. So it's a specialty, but it takes a little bit of time to get. And I mean, we also have common loons year round, or not year, well, maybe year round, but we have common loons for most of the year. And that is a cool specialty, because in many other locations, common loons are declining in numbers, but in Georgian Bay, they appear, at least from my anecdotal experience, to be relatively stable. Our gulls and terns, Georgian Bay with the large rock islands is perfect habitat for colonial nesting birds, being our gulls and terns. And there's been several different locations I found with, 100 or 1,000 plus gull colonies or tern colonies. So it's another very unique spot to be able to look at some stuff like that. And then prairie warblers, which I'll talk about, they have a very limited breeding range, and Georgian Bay happens to fall into that. So our shorebirds, I've showed you a few of them. And as you may be able to tell, shorebirds are a bit of my love. I've since beginning birding in Georgian Bay, I've really fallen in love with shorebirds because of the difficulty in identifying them, because of the kind of rare nature of actually being able to see shorebird flocks, and just how unique all of them are. So the reason I'm highlighting shorebirds is because of the difficulty in identifying them sometimes. So on the left, we have a Wimbrel, and this is our probably easiest to identify shorebird. Large bill. It's a big bodied bird, looks kind of like a crow on stilts with an accentuated bill. And then on the right, we have 2 species of plovers with shorter bills, and looking very similar despite being 2 different species. So the story about this Wimbrel that we found is I was doing my big day last year, and a big day, like a big year, is trying to find the most number of species in a single day. And I had it had been an iffy morning, an iffy start to the big day. There wasn't a lot of migration happening. Warblers were not really passing through. And I was kind of slow getting into the boat to go up into Go Home Bay and up into Georgian Bay. And what really made me slow is someone who shall remain nameless dropped our scope in the water. As we were rushing to fill up the boat with all our goods to go to the cottage, the scope fell off and landed in the water. And we spent an hour that I could have spent birding, attempting to rescue the scope unsuccessfully. We did end up getting it later, so it is thankfully back in our possession, but it spent a couple days submerged at the bottom of Georgian Bay. And so I was feeling quite downtrodden as I was starting my Georgian Bay side of my big day, and kind of had resigned myself to not get close to the record and just to continue on. And we hit a rock I lovingly call Cormorant Rock because there's a breeding colony of cormorants there. Many of you may know it. It's out on the way to Cognishine. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna put my breeding bird hat on and count the number of nests we have on this rock, because we need to have an accurate count to know how the population is changing. And as I'm counting these cormorants, my mom says, "Oh, there's a shorebird," and I'm thinking, "Oh, it's just one of the common shorebirds. There's no way there's anything rare because I've had such a bad day so far. They're not going to find anything cool out here." She says, "It's got a really long bill." And so I thought that warranted maybe a deeper inspection. And I swing my Nox to the side, see it, and immediately say, "That's a Wimbrel." So that was the first time I'd ever seen a Wimbrel in my life. That was my lifer Wimbrel. Lifer being the first time you see a bird in your life, common term we use in birding. And it was very uplifting to suddenly have such a rarity and such a new bird for me. So I did manage to complete the rest of my big day despite losing the scope, and finished with a pretty healthy 114 species for the day. And the story about the plovers is how, well, there's two sides to the story. One is you can will birds into existence if you try hard enough. But the actual side of the story is if you follow migration, you can predict what might be coming. And so I follow the birds that pass through the Kenora district because my grandmother lives up there, and I like to keep, a knowledge of what's happening up there. Also because when fall migration starts, things move through there first. So I can see what's moving through before it comes down to Georgian Bay. And American golden plovers, which is the kind of daintier bird of the two, this guy right here, had been moving through Kenora starting the Monday of that week. And I knew we were going to the cottage on Saturday. And so my parents heard me say, "We're going to see an American golden plover in Georgian Bay this weekend," probably 100 times that week leading up to going to the cottage. I wouldn't stop talking about American golden plovers, much to their annoyance. And so we decided to go up to the cottage. We got there a little late on the Friday, so we couldn't go out to Gray. And we decided to go the next day, bright and early. So you can see the sun is just rising here. And the first bird I saw on Gray Island was this shimmering plover. And it looked golden in the light. And I thought, that's a golden plover. It's also an American golden plover, but it was a golden plover. And so even though I had said we're going to see an American golden plover 100 times that week, I hadn't actually looked at non-breeding plumage for an American golden plover, which this guy is in. And so we're scrolling through our field guides on our phone, and we passed by the bird, and we decided we'll double back, we'll take some more photos and go past the bird again. And the second time I saw the bird, I thought, wow, that is not as shimmering golden as I thought it was going to be. It looked way different. And that's because the second time we saw this guy, right? This guy right here. That's a black-bellied plover, also in non-breeding plumage. So a difficult ID between the two of them. And suddenly I was thinking, oh, well, the first bird we saw was a black-bellied plover. There was no American golden plover ever. It was just a black-bellied plover. That's not golden enough. So we decided to go a third time. And the third time is when I snapped this photo. And when we realized there were 2 birds on the island. So somehow, despite passing very slowly, in fact, just drifting through the water past these birds, we only ever picked out one of them at a time until the third try. And we did manage to see one of each species. And when you compare the two, I mean, the picture doesn't do it justice, but when you see it in the field, it's a very visible difference in plumage color. And so the other thing you can take from that story is sometimes you have to try more than once to find all the birds on any given rock. And in this case, we had to try 3 or 4 times to see them both. And that American golden plover was a lifer for me as well. So that was quite exciting. Then we have our waterfowl. And I thought about having a really beautiful photo of a loon, because wouldn't that be nice for a presentation? Everyone would love a photo of a loon instead of this blob in the distance. But then I realized that that's not exactly truly correct to Georgian Bay. We get a lot of really close loons. We do get some beautiful photos and beautiful looks at a loon. But often when you're birding Georgian Bay, especially when you're out in a boat, this is the look that you get. This loon was diving down every time we decided to start up the engine. So we would try to get upwind from it, turn off the engine, and drift down. And this is the closest we got with a zoom lens. And it would just constantly dive up and down. And you may be wondering why I was so eager to take a photo of a loon, especially such a bad photo as this. And that was because this photo was taken in October. And in October, that's when our rare waterfowl will come. That's when we might have a red-throated loon, when we might have a Pacific loon, when we might have our scoters and our greater scops and red-breasted mergansers all passing through. So I thought, I've got to get a photo of this, because what if the 500th loon I've seen this year is actually a red-throated loon? And there's no happy end to this story, or no, exultant end of a red-throated loon. It is a common loon. A red-throated loon has a much thinner bill, which points further upward. And a Pacific loon has a black chin strap under the neck, which is difficult to see, but this bird does not have a chin strap. So this is one of those misses, I say with air quotes, because I mean, seeing a loon is never really a miss, but it wasn't exactly the loon that we had hoped for. So waterfowl are a fantastic thing about Georgian Bay, but sometimes the rare ones are a lot harder to find. And then for our gulls and terns, these are 2 common terns perched upon the Parks Canada sign for Georgian Bay Islands National Park, Grey Island. And we have some absolutely fantastic breeding colonies of terns. If you've ever wanted to see 500 Caspian terns, go out to South Watcher Island. There's a colony of Caspian terns, herring gulls, common or ring-billed gulls, and common terns on Grey Island. And it is one of the most spectacular sights you will ever see, a large breeding colony of thousands and thousands of birds. Because, I mean, the smell hits you before the sight does, but it's worth the smell to see just that number of birds. It's reminiscent of looks that we might have seen 100 years ago when, passenger pigeons were flying through the sky, and before humans had such a large impact on our bird species. So gulls and terns are definitely a specialty of Georgian Bay. There's large breeding colonies. I've seen herring gulls already on nests this year when we went up in April. I've seen about a 400 strong herring gull colony on an island. And we also get black terns, which is a bit of a rarity throughout Ontario. So there's some really, despite gulls being somewhat of a less interesting bird for a lot of people, there's a lot of diversity in the family and a lot of cool sights you can see if you like to see lots of birds in one place, and cool smells too, though those aren't always as fun. And then my favorite warbler, the Prairie Warbler, the other specialty of Georgian Bay. This warbler has recently been listed as an S2 species, which means there's likely 20 or less breeding populations left in Ontario. And the majority of the breeding populations are located in Georgian Bay. If you're north of Beausoleil, all the way up to about probably Sans Souci, maybe a bit further north. So we have an unreal concentration of prairie warblers. And you can distinguish this warbler by that black semicircle under the eye. That's diagnostic for the species. But also the males will have this kind of rusty patch on their back. And they have that kind of ascending, buzzy, warbly trill. The do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. And I can't say what a blessing it is to be able to wake up to that every single morning at the cottage, or to look out my porch window with a cup of coffee in my hand and a prairie warbler singing in the tree right next to it. And Georgian Bay is really the only place in Ontario that they breed. And you would be amazed at what other birders will do to chase a prairie warbler. So I subscribe to a rare bird alert. So I get to see all the rare birds across the province. And I subscribe to all the rare birds across the province because I love looking at what other people get to see that I won't have time for. But this bird always comes up right about now, and people start posting prairie warblers all across the province that are migrating up through southern Ontario. And that's the time that I really get to smile, because I know as soon as I step off the boat, I'll hear one at my cottage. And I don't need to drive 4 hours to Point Pelee to see a prairie warbler. And in addition to that, I did go to Point Pelee this year, and my friends convinced me to chase a prairie warbler, knowing full well that I definitely see one in Georgian Bay within a week. So when to bird Georgian Bay, there's again, no bad time to bird Georgian Bay. But what I want to be able to give to you is some ability to, if you want to spend your time enjoying your cottage and not driving out to the outer islands, then you can optimize your birding time across Georgian Bay. So if you have fallen in love with shorebirds from my talk, just as I have from seeing them in person, your best time to see shorebirds is end of April to the end of May for the spring migration, and then end of July to about end of September for the fall migration. And if you're really eager, purple sandpipers, which are incredibly rare across Ontario, migrate through Georgian Bay in October. And I've been out to our cottage the last 3 years looking for them on Thanksgiving with no success, but I know one of these years I'll get one. And the reason for these kind of differences in migration, why spring is only 1 month and fall is significantly longer, is the shorebirds will migrate up to the Arctic to breed. And then the adults leave first and the juveniles follow afterwards. So there's this kind of staggered fall migration where you can get a bunch of different species like that American golden plover and the black-bellied plover together, as opposed to this, which was taken in spring migration. And the only real different bird is this guy right here. That's a ruddy turnstone. But the rest of these are black-bellied plover. So this guy is a black-bellied plover in breeding plumage. These guys are ones in non-breeding plumage. So you can see they don't have quite as significant of a black chest. You can even see this back one here has kind of a spotty black chest. So you'll see these variances in plumage as well. And my favorite time to bird shorebirds is May, because you get them in breeding plumage and they look really pretty. But fall is more of a challenge, which can be fun. If you're looking for waterfowls, we have ducks all the time. We have loons all the time. But if you're looking for some of the rarer ones, April and September are your best bet. And even into October, you can still get some rare scoters, some rare loons potentially. We usually go out to Beausoleil the week after Thanksgiving. So that's when we get some rare scoters. If you're going for waterfowl, it's a bit trickier, but if you can land on an island with a scope, you can get a lot of stuff. I've seen horned grebes, red-breasted mergansers, large numbers of geese migrating through with a scope on an island. And then gulls and terns whenever there's no ice. Terns are a bit more particular than gulls. We start seeing our Caspians at the end of April. Our commons come in at the start of May, and they leave once they're finished breeding, usually sometime in August. But the gulls were on nests in the middle of April last year and at the end of April this year. And they stay until basically it ices over. I was seeing some still in October. So if you're a gull aficionado, you can go look for gulls at any time. April and May being the best when they're on their nests and there's the large colonies of them. But pretty much any time for gulls with, about 3 or 4 months returns. And then prairie warblers, again, they're a summer bird, so you can see them all summer, but the optimal times are May and June, because that's when they're perching on branches to sing to attract a mate. That's when they're in their full breeding plumage. And once you hit kind of end of June, July, and August, they start, feeding their young, caring for their young. So they're a lot quieter, a lot harder to find. If you do find a nest, send me a message, because part of the breeding bird work is to map out what birds are nesting, and prairie warblers are notoriously hard to find nests for. And then where to bird Georgian Bay besides your cottage? I mean, if you have a cottage or you have a boat, you're going to have, Georgian Bay is your oyster. You can go anywhere. This is for those of us who are landlubbers and don't have access. So there's a number of different spots where you can actually get a good look at the bay, to take, get a look at some migration if your boat's not in the water or if you don't have access to one. So the location down in Port Severn, this is probably my favorite landlubber birding spot, because they just redid it, and the locks at Port Severn have parking. It's gorgeous. You can look on the top of the locks in Gloucester Pool. You can look below the rapids, and there's often trumpeter swans there in the winter. You get a large number of ducks migrating through there. Pretty nice option. This other one is along, I believe it's the Golf Course Road by Oak Bay. If you just kind of follow it to where it dead ends, you can park there and get a little bit of a look out into the bay, where you can get some terns flying over, some cool, again, ducks out there on migration. It looks out to where the rapids come under the 400. So it's a nice place to get bufflehead in the winter, or common goldeneye if you're looking for those. There is this top location is a location up by Honey Harbor. So actually where Honey Harbor Marina is, there's a little wetland before that, which has some really cool birds in it. We've seen marsh wren there. There's been red-headed woodpecker in the area, red-bellied woodpecker. That one you can't scope out into the bay, but it's a nice wetland to get, Sora, some of the marsh birds as well. And then the other three are just lookouts into various different parts of the bay. So this one looks out here. This one looks out this way, and then this one looks out this way. And they're just like little lookouts you can look out from the road. So again, Georgian Bay is a difficult place to look without a boat. But if you're brave, you can always go out in a canoe. If there's not a lot of boats. But if you have access to a cottage, that is by far your best way. And then honorary mention goes to Beausoleil, which is over this way. Beausoleil is underbirded and absolutely incredible. So if you have a chance to camp on Beausoleil or go there for a day, I know if you camp, you get the ferry ride over for free. I believe there's a complimentary ferry ride. And there's been Cerulean Warblers sighted over there on migration. I believe we have our only record of a prothonotary warbler out there. We have lots of rare ducks in the fall. You have tons of pockets of warblers that pass through. And then, October, you can get these large rafts of, 30 to 50 loons as well. So a really good, if you have a chance to get out to Beausoleil, I would highly recommend it. There's not enough people that bird there, and there's a lot of cool stuff there. So then it comes down to what do you want? What should you bring when you're birding in Georgian Bay? And normally people would say binoculars, and normally I would say binoculars, but Georgian Bay is a bit of a special case that if you're doing a lot of birding from boat, a camera is probably almost better than binoculars, because especially shorebirds, gulls, ducks, all can be very tricky, especially when you're in fall migration, their plumage has changed. So a camera is kind of your best bet at actually being able to identify it, because you can take a few photos, look with binoculars, get an attempt for an ID, but it took me probably 2 years of photographing shorebirds before I felt really comfortable with the IDs, because they're a tricky group of birds. Same with gulls. I still photograph weird looking gulls. You get the common herring gulls that all look the same, but then you get that second-year herring gull that is kind of grayish and the bill has a lot more black on it, and you get a photo just in case. So binoculars as well, absolutely essential if you're a birder, and I would never leave home without them. I would also probably never leave home without a camera when I'm birding in Georgian Bay. A scope is optional if you have the opportunity to land on an island. It's quite neat to be able to scope some of the waters. That's how I get horned grebe, red-breasted merganser, those waterfowl that we were talking about. You can also see bald eagles perched on rocks that look like they shouldn't have bald eagles on them, which is always fun. And can be quite useful for identifying some of the migrating hawks that we sometimes get in the spring and the fall. And then I cheekily put padded seat cushion, because our boat of choice for getting to the outer islands is a wooden Giesler, and my butt has been quite sore after some of those rides, especially when the waves are a meter or more high. And the last thing I will mention is we will be doing another Muskoka Big Day. So this was last year's. I actually hit 114 species, just not 5 included. And this year we're doing a big day to support bird conservation in Georgian Bay. So Eleanor Proctor, one of our other staff members, and myself will be birding across Georgian Bay and the surrounding area, attempting to see as many bird species as possible, ideally 128. And it's going to be a lot of fun. You'll be able to follow along in a trip report like this that will update as we go. And you'll get to see all the places we're birding and all the birds we're getting to see. And I believe Sarah can most likely post a link in the chat if you want more information about that. So at this time, that's all I have for my presentation. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks so much, Aaron. That was a fantastic presentation. Yes, if anyone has questions for Aaron, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will read those out. And I will also put in that link to more about the big day. Okay, so our first question here is from Tom. He says, I really love your passion. Our cottage is in Point of Barrel. Can you comment on the white-throated sparrow? Are they declining? Have you heard the vocal variation that appears to be occurring from the west to east?
I can comment on my anecdotal observations. White-throated sparrows are, it's such an interesting bird. So I was birding yesterday on kind of a birding around the area, and within 5 minutes of each other, I heard 2 different variations of the white-throated sparrow call. So white-throated sparrow, for those of you who don't know, is the "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada," and it's a whistle. So the white-throated sparrow has adapted to human interference by changing the pitches. So some white-throated sparrows start high and then drop low. So the O part, the O sweet, is descending and then it gets to a low tone. Whereas other ones will actually start low and go high. So it's "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." I can't comment on much more than it's a very interesting variation. And I've heard the variation within 5 minutes of each other on migration. So one of my hypotheses could be that, like American toads, they sing at different pitches to attract mates, because 2 different pitches is easier to distinguish between or two different pitches is easier to distinguish between different individuals. So American toads will sing low, and the next one that comes in will sing higher than that. So it's 2 different pitches. So it could be something like that. It could be the going hypothesis is human interference has kind of caused them to change their song so it can be heard more easily. And maybe there's something to do with stronger males having one or the other of the songs, but it's an interesting adaptation, that's for sure. And I'm really intrigued to see how the variation, I kind of hear them equally right now, but I'd be interesting to see how the variation changes over the years, whether one becomes more dominant than the other.
Right. There's a comment from Caroline that she heard the different vocalizations last year too. Okay, Tom is wondering if you can tell us more about a prairie warbler nest. You were asking people to look out for them.
Yeah, they nest in junipers. So I was looking in the wrong place last year, which might have been part of the problem. They nest low in junipers, and most warblers will kind of pull grasses or fir or kind of whatever building material they can. I would hazard a guess that, like the whippoorwill, they nest in the so if you were to divide the branches up into thirds, they nest in the outer third of the plant. So not all the way densely in the middle, but kind of on the outer edge somewhere. So really look in junipers for them. And I mean, obviously don't smack the juniper around, just gently move them. And the best way to find any bird's nest is to just watch. So the second best time to start birding is pretty much right now, when birds are on territory and they're starting to build nests and have young. So as soon as they have young, they're going to be carrying food back and forth. So chickadees feed their young something like 5,000 caterpillars a day. And so that chickadee is going to be moving back and forth constantly through the day. So when you're at your cottage and having your coffee, watch where the birds and see where they're returning to, because that'll give you a good hint as to where the nest. So if you see a chickadee or a prairie warbler in this case carrying a bunch of worms or caterpillars into a juniper, that's your best guess as to where you're going to be able to find the nest. And often you don't even need to pick apart the junipers. You can pretty much just find it by moving yourself into different positions as you're watching the bird dive into the bushes.
Okay, great. Jane Ann is wondering what kind of camera you have or what you would recommend for people.
I would recommend, there's like a Canon PowerShot, I think is what I've heard. I have a Sony A6000 with a zoom lens, which is I think 220 millimeters. My camera is very bad. I use it for record shots mainly. I mean, I get shots like this and some of the other ones in my presentation, mainly because the birds get so close to me that I can but you don't want too much of one. If you have something that's going to struggle to stabilize, if you're in a boat, you're going to have a lot of issues photographing anything. So I'm really happy with my 220 millimeter, even though it's not a great camera, because it allows me to get some record shots. And I know they're not like going to go on the cover of National Geographic, but they're good enough that I can identify most of the birds afterwards. But I think my dad has something like a 300 millimeter, and that has just like a little extra zoom that's pretty beneficial. But I probably wouldn't go too much higher than something like a 400 or 500 millimeter if you're shooting in a boat a lot, because as soon as you have a lot of noise or movement, it's going to become much harder to focus.
All right. Just a follow up from Caroline about the prairie warbler nest. Should we be reporting it somewhere if we find one?
Yeah, email me.
Okay.
And I can get Sarah to post my email in the chat. But yes, email me because I am the coordinator for the Georgian Bay region of the Breeding Bird Atlas. Well, specifically kind of north of Beausoleil. And so if you see a prairie warbler nest, I'm the guy that needs to know. But you can also submit it to the Breeding Bird Atlas. But again, talking to me is probably the easiest way to get yourself set up with that.
All right, thanks. Janet is wondering, what do we need to do to preserve bird habitats?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So this is something I've been thinking about. I mean, it's not tricky in that natural habitats are always going to be the best for birds. Birds can adapt, they can evolve, they can change their behavior to make themselves make it easier for them to survive. But natural habitats like, the rocky islands of Georgian Bay, the protected areas that we have, like provincial parks, the lands that Gblt manages, all those are going to be the best for birds for sure. But there's interesting things to consider as we think about climate change. So we're seeing birds ranges shift north. So red-bellied woodpeckers, where you would never see in Muskoka or really in Georgian Bay, are starting to push north. Suddenly we're seeing 10 to 20 records a year in Muskoka, or in like I think there was 3 or 4 in Georgian Bay, like southern Georgian Bay, where normally you wouldn't see any. And there's going to be a slow or fast push of birds. So for example, Cerulean Warblers, which are a species at risk, breed in Carolinian forests, but there aren't any Carolinian forests in Georgian Bay. So it raises the question of how do they adapt, and is purely natural, like how do we manage our land to allow these species to survive? And I don't think I have an easy answer for that. Besides the fact, like, one of our most significant birds are whippoorwills and prairie warblers and common nighthawks. Those are some of our most significant Georgian Bay birds. And prairie warblers have room to expand north, most likely, because they are exclusively shoreline breeders. You won't really find them outside of 200-300 meters up the shoreline. I've heard a prairie warbler walked into the back bush of my cottage and no longer hear prairie warblers. So they can move up the coast. Georgian Bay is kind of an amazing ecosystem in that habitat is going to remain that habitat as it moves up. So our most significant birds will have room to change. It's just, how do we deal with the birds that are also going to be coming north? And yeah, there's no easy answer for that. I don't know. Maybe I didn't answer that question well, but it's a tricky one.
We've got a similar question from Michael, wondering what cottagers can do in terms of man-made nesting boxes to attract and sustain bird populations.
Yeah, I would say hands down the best nesting boxes that cottagers can be putting down are swallow nesting boxes. So we have barn swallow, bank swallow. Those are our 2 at-risk swallow species. We have purple martins, which have declined something like 90% in the last decade. In the first atlas in the Muskoka region, we had purple martins in 60% of our squares. So there's 49 squares, 10 by 10 kilometer squares. 60% of those had purple martins. We don't have a single purple martin nesting record this atlas. We lost 60%. Or 100% of the purple martins that nested in Muskoka in 20 years. And they were hugely affected by acid rain, but they need nesting boxes because their old nesting habitats, like old trees, are getting taken down. So if you're thinking about doing nesting boxes, I would recommend starting with swallow nesting boxes. And I know someone who's successfully reintroduced barn swallows. They live up near Parry Sound. They had barn swallows 20 years ago. They stopped having barn swallows. They put up a bunch of barn swallow nesting boxes. Barn swallows are back. So yeah, swallow nesting boxes are the best. It's messy. So I recommend doing some research online as to where you want to place them. But that's probably hands down the best you can do, because prairie warblers rely on junipers and other low-lying shrubs for nesting. There's not too many nest boxes they would use that wouldn't be at risk of predation. And like whippoorwills are ground nesters. There's not much you can do for them in the way of nesting boxes. So swallows are kind of the top of the mind, though owl boxes can also be nice. Saw-whets and barred owls both live up in Georgian Bay.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Jane is wondering the places you were recommending birding from the road. She's wondering the names of those, and
yeah,
we can probably include those in, we're going to send a follow-up email, but if you just want to
Yeah.
name them now, and then we can send more details.
Yeah, so it's Picnic Island Road and Macy's Bay Road are two of them. And it's just, I park on the road and have a scope. And then the other one is Prisk Island Road, which has a little like pull off that you can, like a lot of birding. Birders like dead ends. Birders love dead ends. They're the best thing ever. So often it's, the end of a summer main or end of a winter maintained road, and I just park to the side and bring a scope. So yeah, Picnic Island and Macy's Bay are the two kind of major ones that I use.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we'll include that information in the follow-up email. Okay, back to the Prairie Warbler. Catherine's wondering, what is the difference between a Prairie Warbler nest and other warbler nests? She's thinking other warbler nests are more of a mud nest.
Yeah, so we have 26, maybe 27 species of warblers, and probably about 22 of them nest in Georgian Bay. So you're going to have a huge variety of different warbler nests. So you'll have some that are kind of like weaving grasses together. You have some that might have more of a mud nest or use like, decomposing material or like, aquatic plant, like wet aquatic vegetation. I saw an American redstart nest, which is a species of warbler, in the crook of an alder, and it appeared to be using kind of like a hybrid of muddy vegetation / grass. So you're going to see a kind of a lot of variation in the different warbler species. Like golden winged warblers nest in grass. They just nest in grass and build their nest out of grass. And it's got to be one of the most dangerous nests because it's just built in long grass. And I imagine it could get stepped on very easily. But seems to work for them, sort of. So yeah, you're going to see a big variation. And the best way to kind of know where they might be nesting is to watch where they're building their nest. So watch the birds, figure out what nesting material they're bringing and how they're building. Like black-capped chickadees excavate trees to build their nest. So I wouldn't say there's necessarily one catch-all for warbler nests, but what I could say is many of them are probably kind of eye level or lower. I mean, we had a pine warbler nesting 60 feet up a pine that built their web or their nest out of caterpillar silk. So if you have caterpillars, that's another good way to find nesting birds because they'll actually come to the caterpillar silk, remove it, and carry it and build the nest with it. So that's how we figured out where our pine warbler was nesting. So yeah, a lot of variation in warbler nests, and it's probably a combination of what's available to them and what's easy for them to use.
Okay. Great. Question from Jen about avian flu. What have you heard about it, and is it affecting the birds we discussed here tonight?
Yeah, I've heard it's worse in large birds, so raptors. Obviously, if you have any domestic birds whatsoever, don't feed birds because it passes through domestic birds much easier. And I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that most shorebirds and like warblers and gulls are gonna be somewhat safe from it. It appears to be most significant in like there's a red-tailed hawk in Waterloo that had a case of it. I don't know how many cottagers actually feed birds, and it really only passes at like communal feeding stations. So if you feed birds, maybe consider not feeding birds this summer. I can't imagine too many cottagers are feeding birds that much because of bears, but if you do feed birds, I would recommend at least for the season to take down your feeders. But if you did want to feed birds, do something like an orange feeder for orioles because that's not quite as bad. It's used by a lot less birds, so you're not going to have the same sort of, all birds coming to it. And definitely don't feed birds if you have any sort of domestic fowl of any type.
All right, thanks. We've got 2 questions here about whippoorwills. So Patty is wondering in general, where are the most whippoorwills seen? And then Tom mentions that he used to hear whippoorwills every night at his cottage, which I think, Tom, you mentioned earlier is in Point of Barrel. He doesn't hear them anymore. Are they disappearing?
So whippoorwills are kind of an interesting species, and they nest they're ground nesters, or they nest like low in junipers. A majority of them, so there's kind of a band through Muskoka and the Kawarthas where there's rock barrens, and many of them nest there. And then there's any in the open rock barrens up the coast of Georgian Bay is where they'll nest as well. And it's interesting because they're kind of affected. They were probably more successful when logging was more frequent. So they're like open forest nesters. They don't like a ton of thick vegetation in the understory. They like, spaced out trees with junipers and plenty of room to maneuver, but they also like being near like a wet meadow or something to feed over. So our cottage area used to have whippoorwills, and we lost them. And we have them back again. And I mean, if you wanted to encourage whippoorwills nesting, if you have really dense undergrowth, they're not going to nest there. So Georgian Bay is good for whippoorwills in that it's a bit of a successional ecosystem. There's a lot of like, on the edges of Georgian Bay where there's lots of wind, lots of trees are coming down. So the forests tend to be a lot more open. If you lost your juniper, plant some juniper if you can. But it's a tricky one. I know Couchiching Conservancy has tried to do some whippoorwill restoration, and I'm not sure how successful they were. But they found that whippoorwills, that dense grassy or scrubby vegetation is not something they like. They kind of are like loggerhead shrikes in that they want, some patches of shrubbery, but not a really dense group of it. So, I mean, if you want to open up your forest a little bit, you might be able to attract them back, but they are on the decline. Like all our aerial insectivores have been heavily impacted over the last 10 years. So they're definitely on the decline, but they're not necessarily like, it might also just be due to habitat changes.
Okay, great information. Okay, Jane Ann is wondering a practical question. What do you do to protect yourself from ticks while birding? Because there have been more and more on Georgian Bay, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, I just pick them off at the end of the walk. I mean, I would tuck in my pants if I remembered, but often I'll forget, or I'll be doing wetland surveys and they're not overly conducive for wearing socks to start with. So I would say do a tick check every time you hike in the bush, especially if you know deer are nearby. If you've got a dog, treat your dog with tick medicine. My dog gets NexGard, which is some oral chewable that she does that protects her from ticks. But for humans, like tuck in your pants and do a tick check. I mean, I lived in Wisconsin for 7 years, and I remember one walk. We walked through, I was young. I decided I want to get as many ticks as possible on me. So I ran through all the fields collecting ticks. I picked up 43 ticks that day, which is just a gross amount of ticks. And I think back to young me being so foolish. But yeah, tick, like, honestly, like strip down when you get home and check, like, any kind of hidden areas where they might be like hiding, like armpits or go through your hair frequently. And I mean, tucking your pants into your socks is another good way if you're just hiking and you're not like going hip deep in a wetland like I sometimes do.
All right, thanks. We've got a couple of positive notes here. Linda saying she saw a whippoorwill or heard a whippoorwill for the first time across from Sandy Island since the 80s. And Michael saying that he saw nighthawks for the first time last year on Georgian Bay for the first time in a long time. So those are both nice messages.
Awesome.
And then a slightly less nice message from Catherine saying last year their warbler nests were attacked by gypsy moths, now called spongy moths, caterpillars. Do you know anything about that, or
I don't.
heard of that? Yeah.
I've never heard of that. The one potentially good news for spongy moth is I predict this season in Georgian Bay is going to be probably pretty like low population for them. I don't think I saw a single day flying adult moth last year. So we had millions of caterpillars, and I don't think I saw a single actual adult moth. So my hope is that they got pretty impacted by the parasitic fungus that does better in wet weather, and there may not be a large population this year, but kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah, we definitely had the moths in Honey Harbor, but yeah, it's probably different by area. Okay, I think that's all the questions, unless anyone wants to throw anything else in the chat quickly. But lots of messages here thanking you, Aaron. It was an awesome presentation. And yeah, you'll all have a chance to meet Aaron again, because we're very glad he's now with us. Okay, so thank you all so much, and we'll see you again next month for What's Up with Our Weather. And that is on June 16th, I believe, and all the information will be in the email that goes out to you after this, as well as a recording to this talk if you want to watch it again or see anything you missed. All right, thanks so much, Aaron. Good night, everyone.